Dragon Quest II is a true sequel in every sense of the word. It's a continuation of the Erdrick saga, starring the descendants of the hero from the first adventure, and it takes the core loop of the original game and greatly expands it in every conceivable way. It is, in essence, a bigger and better Dragon Quest, at least in theory, because not all of the changes made were for the better, and in reaching for something far more ambitious, Dragon Quest II also stumbled in many ways. In modern times, the game has, by all rights, earned a reputation as a flawed follow-up to a timeless classic, and the cursed development cycle nearly ended the careers of series co-creators Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura. But when Dragon Quest II was first released in January of 1987, it was very well received, and many Japanese fans remember it fondly decades later, because even the game's most glaring flaws ended up working in its favor. This is my retrospective review of Dragon Quest II, the right game at the right time. When the original Dragon Quest launched in May of 1986, the initial response was underwhelming. Despite a great product bolstered by artwork from legendary mangaka Akira Toriyama, the young Famicom audience didn't know what to do with an RPG. It was only after game designer Yuji Horii took matters into his own hands and leveraged his position at Weekly Shonen Jump to advertise his own game that people really began to see the appeal. Powered by Horii's articles and word of mouth, Dragon Quest eventually became a hit, selling 1 million copies within the first 6 months of its release. Dragon Quest had been deliberately designed as an introduction to the RPG genre, offering a simple, pared-down experience for an inexperienced audience. After getting hooked on the premise and going over the kingdom of Alefgard with a fine-tooth comb, fans of Dorakue, as the series became known in Japan, were ready for something more sophisticated. Horii and Nakamura did not need any convincing to get back to work on another Dragon Quest. In fact, they were already well on their way. After delivering the code to the game's publisher, Enix, there was still the need to produce cartridges, print boxes and manuals, commission advertisements, and distribute the finished product, a process that took a couple of months. In the meantime, Horii and Nakamura immediately got to work on the sequel. Just like the first game, Dragon Quest II would be produced by Koichi Nakamura's company, Chunsoft. Nakamura served as chief programmer and the game's director, while Yuji Horii once again took on the roles of main game designer and scenario writer. Also returning for the second game were 2 celebrity contributors who had joined Dragon Quest's development through a series of fortunate circumstances. Professional composer Koichi Sugiyama, who handled the game's soundtrack, and Akira Toriyama, who was in charge of character and monster design. Planning for Dragon Quest II began around April of 1986, about 1 month before the release of the first game. A lot of the early work went into ironing out the design and figuring out what features to include, and an important part of this process was discussions around memory management. It might seem weird if you're not familiar with software development of the 80s and 90s, but back then, a lot of the choices made by developers were informed by limitations in available memory. Although Nintendo dabbled with other formats, Famicom games of this era mainly came on ROM cartridges, where the entire game had to fit on read-only memory built into the game pack. Memory capacity varied greatly over the Famicom's lifespan and between different games, with some of the earliest titles fitting on a mere 24 kilobytes of memory, while the largest ever, Metal Slayer Glory from 1991, occupied a whole megabyte of data. The original Dragon Quest had been stuffed onto a 64 kilobyte cartridge, but rapid advancements in hardware meant the second game would have almost twice as much memory to work with. Even so, it had to be very carefully managed. In the planning stages, the team held endless meetings to debate how best to allocate this precious resource among game data, monster graphics, audio, character dialogue, and the game's code. The conversations could get pretty intense, and Horii later compared the process to that of a budget committee in the National Diet. Even then, the team's ambitions far outstripped the capabilities of the Famicom hardware. and many items, locations, and story events had to be scrapped to save space. That they were even able to include as much as they did was largely due to the efforts of Koichi Nakamura, who applied his considerable talents to figuring out ingenious solutions to the team's problems, such as creating a program that compressed the map data of the game's vast world down to 1/8 of the original size, freeing up a huge amount of memory to use for other stuff. Once the planning was done, the development team was divided into 2 groups, with one tackling the story and character design while the other handled the programming. The story group first turned its attentions to designing the game's monsters. Horii and his team would brainstorm rough ideas that were then fired off to Toriyama to be turned into proper designs. Rather than working directly with the dev tools, Toriyama painted the monsters in his own style and using his own methods. These drawings were then converted into pixel format by Horii and his team, who also used them for inspiration when finalizing the monsters' names and stats. Active development began in early July and ran until November. Nakamura had originally projected that the game would be released in late December of 1986, but certain difficulties that we'll get into later in this video meant that this deadline had to be extended by about a month. In the end, Dragon Quest II was released for the Nintendo Famicom in Japan on January 26, 1987, a mere 8 months after the first game. And for its time, it was incredibly ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. Before I get into specifics, I want to make something very clear. This video is about the original version of Dragon Quest II for the Nintendo Famicom, better known in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Later remakes of the game for the Super Famicom, Game Boy Color, and mobile devices made many changes that had a significant effect on the overall experience. So if you've played another version of this game, a lot of the issues I bring up will probably sound unfamiliar. Also, I'll be using the names of characters, items, and locations from Dragon Warrior 2, the 1990 North American localization, which are often different from both the ones in the Japanese original as well as later English translations. At a glance, the first 2 Dragon Quests look pretty much the same, but the sequel actually brought a lot to the table. Dragon Quest II was the first in the series to introduce 4-directional facing, meaning that characters now face the direction they were traveling instead of crab walking across the screen. A change that was retroactively added to the North American version of the first game. The sequel also got a more elaborate tileset for towns and dungeons, the character sprites show a wider range, and the game's roster of enemies have a bit more detail, doing a better job of conveying the charm of Akira Toriyama's whimsical monster designs in the 8-bit format. But more importantly, Dragon Quest II was the first game in the series to feature battles against multiple monsters, with some fights pitting the heroes against up to 8 enemies at the same time. But all of this monster goodness came at a cost. Even though Dragon Quest II had more memory to work with, fitting a small army of monsters on the screen took a lot of juice, and this meant it just wasn't feasible to show any other visuals at the same time. So the cute landscape backdrop from the first game's combat screen had to go, replaced with the same empty black void used for Dragon Quest's dungeons. It was a step back in terms of immersion, but the opportunity to see individual enemies get eliminated from the field of battle one by one was a major innovation, even when compared to some of the computer RPGs that inspired Dragon Quest in the first place. Still, these improvements were fairly minor, and while the game's graphics were more than acceptable for their time, they were quickly surpassed by titles like Phantasy Star and Final Fantasy. Instead, the bulk of Dragon Quest II's innovations lie beneath the surface. The core gameplay remains very faithful to the formula set down in the first game. This time, you are the Prince of Maidenhall, a descendant of the hero from the original Dragon Quest who must join forces with his royal cousins in order to foil the plans of Hargon, an evil priest who is trying to bring about an age of misery and destruction. Your adventure takes place in a large overworld or world map, viewed from a top-down perspective, filled with monster-infested dungeons and pastoral villages. Exploration takes you through plains, forests, hills, and poisonous swamps, and you'll eventually get your hands on a sailing ship that lets you cross the ocean to reach distant lands. Enemies are fought in random encounters that reward you with experience points and gold, and a lot of the gameplay revolves around these battles, since you'll have to fight a lot of monsters to get strong enough to defeat Hargon. Combat is turn-based, and you select your commands from a menu before the start of each round. Outside of battle, the same command-based menu system is used to interact with the world. But Dragon Quest II also made several welcome improvements to the fundamental mechanics. For the first time in the series, you can now get treasure from defeated monsters. Text scroll speed feels a lot faster even on the default setting, so combat runs smoother. And the menu has been simplified in several ways. 4-directional facing means you no longer have to pick the direction of the NPC or door you want to interact with, as in the Japanese version of the first game. There's no stairs option, since the heroes simply ascend or descend stairs by walking over them. Using search now also opens chests, so there's no need for the take command, and keys are used as items from your inventory, so the door command has played out its role too. This spring cleaning of the game's interface makes navigation less clunky, but it also made space in the menu for a new command, one which hadn't been necessary in the first game. To avoid overwhelming newcomers to the genre, the first Dragon Quest took a super basic approach to weapons and armor. Whatever you bought, you automatically equipped, and if you already had something in that slot, the game would even sell it for you. Dragon Quest II reintroduced the equip menu, giving you the responsibility to manage your own gear by designating which items you're actually using. Dragon Quest II also did a lot to raise the bar in an area that would come to define Japanese role-playing games for decades to come: story. Where Dragon Quest leaned heavily into the default narratives of Western fantasy, Dragon Quest II began a slow transformation away from the most basic plots and towards something a bit more unique. Set in the same world as the first game, the story takes place 100 years later. This time, you're not a wandering warrior, but a prince with duties and obligations to the kingdom of Maidenhall, and you're soon joined by your royal cousins from the neighboring kingdoms of Cannock and Moonbrook. All three characters are descendants of the hero from the first game, who, after defeating the Dragon Lord, left Alafgard with Princess Gwaelin to establish a kingdom of his own. That kingdom is now under siege by the forces of Hargon, the evil high priest who serves as the game's antagonist. There's not a lot of dialogue and almost no character development, and Dragon Quest II's narrative doesn't hold a candle to the RPG stories of the 1990s. But when seen through the lens of late 80s console gaming, Dragon Quest II absolutely raised the bar when it came to storytelling. The quest is longer, more complex, and much more engaging. Instead of just going on a scavenger hunt for a list of items you need to defeat the big bad, you're now following a series of story beats, many of which also have a significant impact on the user experience. You begin the game alone, but soon link up with the Prince of Cannock, rewarding you with a new companion and passage to the continent of Moonbrook. On the new continent, you explore a ruined castle haunted by ghosts and free the Princess of Moonbrook from a curse that's turned her into a dog, completing the 3-person ensemble. And in the town of Lienport, you rescue a young woman from monsters, earning you a sailing ship from her grateful grandfather. To make the story more interesting, Yuji Horii also added a series of twists. The Princess of Moonbrook isn't just a damsel in distress to be rescued, but a brave and capable companion who joins you on your quest after you break her curse. At the bottom of Charlock Castle, the Dragon Lord's power-hungry descendant aids the heroes with useful advice against a common enemy, reasoning that Hargon is the greater threat to its perceived birthright. And when you finally make it to Hargon's Hall, you find a perfect replica of Maidenhall Castle, and must break the illusion before carrying on. The adventure is also enriched by the increased quality of the game's soundtrack. Composer Koichi Sugiyama's work on the original Dragon Quest was considered groundbreaking for a console title at the time, but he was still finding his feet in working with the Famicom's primitive sound chip. Dragon Quest II's soundtrack was a major leap forward, not just in the quality of the compositions, but also in the breadth of music used. Where Dragon Quest had only a single overworld theme that played throughout the world, Dragon Quest II uses 4 different tracks for overworld exploration, including one for when you're sailing the seas. The team's ambitions went far beyond what actually made it into the game. One major feature they wanted to include was a series of cutscenes centered around full-size still images inspired by kamishibai, a sort of street performance aimed at children that became popular in early 20th century Japan, featuring paper cards with illustrations brought to life by a skilled narrator. In the game, these images would have been coupled with text narration and used to illustrate important story beats, and the team completed several of these scenes before realizing they wouldn't have enough memory to include them. The idea was scrapped, but since they already had the images done, one of them got printed in black and white in the story section of the Japanese instruction manual, showing the dying soldier delivering the news of Moonbrook's destruction to the King of Maidenhall. Dragon Quest II's story was a big step forward for a console RPG. It had twists and turns, a more elaborate world with a bit more detailed environments, and even a couple of NPCs with some actual personality. My favorite being the Prince of Cannock's sassy sister, who berates you for wasting time instead of fighting monsters if you dare show up at the castle after joining up with her brother. And even though your companions never say much, and their names are assigned at random on each playthrough, the Prince of Cannock and the Princess of Moonbrook were still the first legitimate characters to ever join you on your quest in a Dragon Quest game. But as big an impact as these characters may have had on the story, the introduction of a player party had an even greater effect on the core gameplay. In the words of its creators, Dragon Quest was an introductory game for the Famicom users who had no experience with RPGs. In other words, a proof of concept, intended to sell an entire genre of games to a massive new audience. Dragon Quest had proven the formula, but for Horii and Nakamura, it was just a step in the right direction. Many of the more advanced features of the RPG genre hadn't been possible to include. Now, with better hardware, a more experienced team, and an audience that hungered for further adventure, Dragon Quest II was a chance to reintroduce one of those features. Many computer RPGs of the time, like Wizardry or The Bard's Tale, had you construct a party of characters before you started the game. This process put a lot of power in the player's hands and could be plenty of fun, but it could also overwhelm new users. Worried that many of the kids who sat down to play Dragon Quest II would do so without having played the first game, Horii wanted to keep the early game as simple as possible. Instead of starting you out with a full party, Dragon Quest II would put you in control of a single character, then have you recruit the other teammates along the way. Once the team had decided to implement this feature, they next had to determine how large the party should be. In the end, they settled on 3 heroes, a relatively small number compared to the computer RPGs of the time. But this particular number wasn't arrived at by chance, nor was it a stylistic choice. It was a decision very much driven by practical concerns. The first of these had to do with the limitations of the hardware. Horii decided that if you were going to have a party of multiple characters, he wanted them all to be shown on screen during exploration. While PC games could get away with using a single character to represent the entire party when moving about the world, Horii felt that this would be unacceptable for Famicom users. But as anyone familiar with the Famicom knows, once you start to put too much stuff on the screen at once, some interesting stuff happens. To compose its visuals, the Famicom works with sprites, individual 8x8 pixel bitmaps that could be moved and animated independently of the background and other sprites. Dragon Quest II's characters are 16 pixels wide and 16 pixels tall, so in order to render a single character, a total of 4 sprites had to be arranged in a square pattern. But the Famicom was only able to show a total of 8 sprites on a single horizontal scanline at the same time. If you tried to show more, something would end up missing in every frame, causing that distinctive flicker kids of my generation remember so well. Given this limitation, Horii reasoned that a party of 3 characters would be the practical upper limit, since this would allow the heroes to line up horizontally to talk to an NPC drawn on the same horizontal scanline without any issues. Another valid reason to keep the number of characters small had to do with how the game tracked your progress. Just like in Dragon Quest, the Japanese version of Dragon Quest II didn't allow you to save your game. Instead, it used a password system called the Spell of Restoration. It might seem almost absurd if you weren't a console gamer back in the 80s, but being able to actually save your progress used to be more a novelty than the expectation. Many Famicom games forced you to start all over from the beginning every time you booted them up, while others made you copy down lengthy passwords on pieces of paper, then feed them back in on the start screen the next time you played. And if you messed something up when you scribbled it down, you were totally boned. In the case of Dragon Quest II, more party members meant more data to store in the passwords. Each hero's items and attributes had to be tracked, along with what they were wearing and how much experience they'd earned. And that was on top of other parameters the game had to track, like which crests you'd found, how much gold you carried, where you'd saved your game, and whether you had the ship. Even with Nakamura's best efforts in clever data management, the passwords that had been 20 characters long in the first game exploded to an absurd 52 characters in the second. Even though Dragon Quest II's party was relatively small, its introduction fundamentally changed how the game was played. In Dragon Quest, if your hero's hit points were reduced to 0, you'd simply respawn in front of the king at Tentacle Castle. You'd lose half the gold you carried, but you'd keep everything else, and you could head right back out without missing a beat. In Dragon Quest II, characters that fall in battle follow you around in ghost form, and must be resurrected at a church, at the cost of a sizable donation of gold depending on the character's level. And if all 3 characters should fall in battle, only the hero gets brought back to life for free. But changes like this were marginal, compared to the area of the game where having more than one character mattered the most. The original Dragon Quest had stripped the combat experience down to its bare necessities. A single hero to control and a single monster to worry about in each battle. There were also no stats to assign, no classes to pick from or abilities to choose, and there were no real choices to make when outfitting your character. All of this meant that fighting in the original Dragon Quest was very simple. In Yuji Horii's own words, one-on-one combat was easy to understand and perfect for beginners, but it would eventually become monotonous. For the sequel, he wanted something more strategic. Dragon Quest II uses the same basic combat system as the first game. A first-person perspective, turn-based battles controlled through a menu, and text-based feedback in a dedicated message window. But even though the fundamentals of combat remain the same, the overall experience is quite a bit different. By expanding the player's responsibilities to 3 characters instead of 1, you now have a lot more choices to make while fighting. This allowed Yuji Horii to introduce a feature taken from wizardry that hadn't made sense to include in the first game. The parry command, which allows a character to take up a defensive posture for the coming round, cutting the amount of damage they take by roughly half. The game's spell list also more than doubled, including the introduction of an entirely new class of spells that would become a crucial part of the Dragon Quest experience. Buffs and debuffs that indirectly impact the outcome of battle. Adding to the tactical element, the 3 characters all came with their own strengths and weaknesses. The game's hero, the Prince of Maidenhall, is a straight-up fighter, the only mainline Dragon Quest hero who cannot use magic at all. The Prince of Cannock mixes healing magic and defensive charms with limited offensive spellcasting and modest fighting ability. And the Princess of Moonbrook is a straight-up mage, trading all of her ability with weapons for powerful spells. But it wasn't just the introduction of a party that increased the complexity of the game's combat. The monsters got organized too. For the first time in the Dragon Quest series, you now have to contend with entire groups of enemies, including multiple types of monsters fighting together. This feature drives a lot of strategic thinking, especially since your decisions are influenced by 2 important design choices. The first of these is group targeting, which means you target groups of monsters rather than individuals. So if you're up against a magician and 3 centipods, you can only choose which of the 2 groups to target, and when the character makes their attack, they pick a member of the targeted group at random, which is where the second of these design choices comes in, the lack of auto-targeting. Basically, if every monster in a targeted group has already been defeated by the time the character makes their attack, they won't pick another monster instead. Their attack will simply fail. Group targeting and the lack of auto-targeting might seem strange or even frustrating today, but it promotes strategic thinking and rewards player skill. Instead of just spamming the A button until the monsters are all dead, you have to carefully think about where to place your attacks. Knowing how much damage each character is likely to do, remembering how much HP different monsters roughly have, and being able to do quick mental calculations and determine the odds adds a level of mastery to combat that just wouldn't be there without these features, and makes every battle a series of tactical decisions. This design philosophy is also supported by the sheer variety of monsters in Dragon Quest II. Not counting the final confrontation with the Dragon Lord, Dragon Quest had 38 different monsters, but only 13 unique sprites. The rest were palette swaps. Again, not counting the final battle, Dragon Quest II has 80 different monsters, more than twice as many as in the original. And the difference is even more stark when you consider that those 80 enemies are variations on 36 unique sprites, nearly 3 times as many as in the first game. Many of these enemies have to be handled in different ways. Dragon Quest had a handful of enemies that encouraged special tactics, but Dragon Quest II greatly expands on this concept. The army ant can call more of its kind to aid in battle, overwhelming you with numbers if you can't keep up. The Babble's attacks can afflict your characters with poison that lingers after combat, and the Puppet Man can drain your MP with its strange jig. Some enemies also require special care depending on the company they keep. The healer is mostly harmless, but will restore its allies' hit points in battle. The Carnivog can put the party to sleep with its sweet breath, and the Gorgon focuses all of its efforts on buffing the other monsters, making them a nightmare to deal with in certain situations. All of these changes and improvements meant that getting into battle in Dragon Quest II is a lot more exciting than in the first game. Sometimes maybe too exciting, because more than just about any RPG I've played, Dragon Quest II has the ability to inspire genuine terror. In Dragon Quest II, each battle is its own little puzzle to solve, and because the enemy formations you face are so varied, I often found myself adjusting my tactics to deal with different combinations of monsters. Combat is chock full of meaningful choices, and those choices can often be critical to your survival, because Dragon Quest II is a lot harder than the first game. Random encounters can be absolutely brutal, and you're never too far from complete disaster, which can be especially nerve-wracking when you're deep in a dungeon. With how tough encounters can get, the little things start to seem very big. Every lucky ambush, every dodged attack, every healing spell that lands ends up feeling super significant, and this is especially true when it comes to fleeing. Dragon Quest II is one of the few times in RPG gaming when the option to run from battles became a cornerstone of my overall strategy. While I'm no stranger to the coward's approach of skipping every single battle to speedrun a dungeon, in Dragon Quest II it's really more about picking and choosing when to fight and when to flee. In fact, this risk-reward analysis might just be the single most important skill you can master in this game. Dragon Quest II embraces the fundamental principle of the random encounter, that not all encounters are created equal. Because the monster formations are so varied in numbers and strength, every time the screen flashes and goes black, it's a moment of real tension. Some groups of monsters just aren't worth fighting, especially if you're far from town. But running also comes at great risk. Fleeing often fails, and when it does, the enemies get a free round of attacks, leaving you in a worse position than before you started. So picking your moment to run can be quite critical. every battle you enter must be carefully assessed to determine if it's worth sticking around. And even if you do decide to flee, it can often be worth it to take out a single particularly dangerous enemy before you attempt to run, just to maximize your chances of getting out alive. And I have to admit that the kind of nail-biting decision-making this design demands is kind of cool. But it can also be pretty stressful, and that's definitely intentional. The devs knew very well that waiting to find out if you got away or not could be incredibly tense. For dramatic effect, they added a short delay between the moment you try to run and the point where you see the outcome. And getting held in suspense like this can be quite powerful. Every time I tried to run from battle, I'd hold my breath as I waited to learn my fate, and every time I made it safely away, I'd heave a sigh of genuine relief. It's a physical thing, and it's kinda cool to see just how much of an impact the experience had on me. It's not something modern games often manage to do. But as much as I can see some silver linings in the game's encounter design, there's also lots to find fault with, because not all of the game's difficulty is driven by intentional design choices. A lot of it comes from shoddy balancing. Many enemies are overtuned. Monsters like the saber tiger can take away half of a character's hit points in one swipe. The blizzard can end your whole party with a single spell, and you're going to hate your life when you run into 4 green dragons, especially if they take your party by surprise. From a modern perspective, some of these encounters can seem utterly unfair, but as frustrating as Dragon Quest II can be at times, I don't think this kind of design is inherently bad. With the right sort of deliberate tweaks, an approach like this could have been really cool. After all, it's basically the same principle as in Elden Ring, but Elden Ring is a much better designed experience, and it's an action game. When you're stuck in a turn-based system where, despite your best efforts, win or lose quite often comes down to a roll of the dice, it can get pretty tiresome. But Dragon Quest II's biggest flaw isn't awkward balancing or luck-based mechanics. It's that the game fails to deliver on what might just be the most fundamental characteristic of all RPGs. A big part of the draw of the RPG genre is the feeling of making steady and lasting progress. Regardless of player skill, gaining levels, mastering new spells and abilities, and upgrading your equipment all contribute to making you stronger, allowing you to not only tackle new challenges that used to be out of reach, but also to make a mockery out of the monsters you fought before. There's a rags to riches feel to these games, starting at the bottom and working your way to the top. The promise is that the more effort you put in, the easier things will get. But Dragon Quest II doesn't do a very good job of supporting this experience, because the game has the most unsatisfying character progression of any RPG I've ever played. A big part of the problem is equipment. There just aren't a lot of weapons and armor in this game, so you're not going to get an upgrade very often. Dungeons hardly ever provide worthwhile rewards, shops offer only a meager selection, and the vast majority of the stuff you do get can only be used by the hero. There's a total of 16 weapons and 19 armor pieces in this game, but the prince can only use 9 of those weapons and 11 of the armors, while the princess is limited to 4 weapons and 5 pieces of armor. And it gets even worse when you consider what they're allowed to use. The strongest weapon available to the Prince of Cannock is the Iron Spear, a weapon that becomes available in the first few hours of a pretty long game, which means that the prince, who is already pretty bad at fighting, gets progressively weaker the longer the journey goes. And the princess's melee attacks are plain useless. But gear progression is a relatively small problem compared to the more glaring issue. In the original Dragon Quest, gaining even just a single level made you significantly more powerful, and could often mean the difference between being sent packing by the monsters of a new region and being able to stand toe-to-toe with them in combat. So even though grinding for levels could be a tedious process, leveling up was immensely satisfying. In Dragon Quest II, not only is leveling very slow, but the boost you get from each level is quite modest. Stat progression is almost flat, so it's not so much a power curve as a power line. You're likely to finish the game without a character even breaking 200 hit points, and that's including the comparatively generous boost to HP you get at higher levels. And the same holds true for the other stats. Even after leveling up several times, you still take about the same amount of damage from the same enemies. And even if you're way overpowered for where you are, a single lucky crit from a common monster can cut the hero's hit points in half. You get stronger, but you never really get more durable, which means that enemies stay dangerous for much longer. Being able to grind your way into your comfort zone is one of the fundamental promises of the traditional console RPG, and Dragon Quest II completely messes this up. In fact, Dragon Quest II is the perfect demonstration of something we take for granted in RPG design: the importance of good math. Clever damage calculation algorithms and precise tables of attribute gains are extremely crucial to creating an experience that feels fair and rewarding, especially in a turn-based setting. This is the under-the-hood stuff we never really talk about until it all goes wrong. Dragon Quest II can be a pretty exhausting experience, and I've gotta say, this game really did wear me down towards the end. I fought hundreds of battles in the final area before my first attempt at the endgame, and that only got my hero to level 33 out of a possible 50. At this level, the final dungeon was maddeningly frustrating, the bosses at the end were absolutely horrible, and I had to get really lucky to get the win. But even if you get all the best equipment and power your way to max level before taking on Hargon, you're still going to need a bit of luck to finish the game. And a single bad encounter can still wipe your party on the way to the final battle. No matter how much time you spend grinding, Dragon Quest II never really gets easy. And while most of the game's flaws can be excused, it's hard to ignore how fundamentally broken the character progression is. While Dragon Quest II's take on combat is exponentially more complex and interesting than in the first game, awkward math and questionable design choices robs the system of much of its potential power. It's a noble effort, but the execution just isn't there. But there's another part of the game that's just as good as in the original, if not better, even if it too has its own share of issues. The first thing that struck me as I began my journey through Dragon Quest II is just how immense its world feels when you're starting out. The game's manual promises a world more than 4 times the size of Dragon Quest's Alefgard, and this is no idle boast. In fact, they're actually underselling it. The new world, called Torland, is composed of 256 by 256 tiles, versus 100 by 100 in the original, upping the size of the explorable area from 10,000 tiles to 65,536, meaning that Dragon Quest II's world is actually more than 6 times larger than the one in the first game. The expanded scope is also aided by a new mode of transportation. While the hero of Dragon Quest had to make his journey entirely on foot, his descendants in Dragon Quest eventually get their hands on a sailing ship that completely changes the way you explore the world. But the map isn't just bigger this time around. There's also more than twice as many locations to visit, and while the massive size of the map means that these points of interest are spread more thinly across the world, the greater distance between them makes overland travel feel like more of an adventure. Some of my most memorable experiences came from making the perilous trek to remote locations like the Tower of Wind or the Tower of the Moon. To support this feeling of epic adventure, Dragon Quest II had to make a critical change to the original game's flow of exploration. In Dragon Quest, every play session started from the King's Chamber in Tentacle Castle, and the only way to record the progress of your quest was to make your way back there, either on foot or through the use of the return spell. Dragon Quest II lifts this restriction, allowing you to save your game not just at the starting castle, but in several other towns and castles throughout the world. So instead of starting every adventure from Castle Maidenhall, you can now rough it through the wilderness to reach a new town, save your game, and pick things back up from there the next day. The end result is a much stronger sense of adventure, and reaching a new town after a grueling journey through uncharted monster-infested territory is one of the most satisfying feelings you can get in a classic RPG. Since recording your progress was no longer the sole domain of the world's castles, Dragon Quest II could no longer rely on kings alone to serve as the mediators of that function. At first, the team thought about using inns to fill this role, but they eventually decided it would be a better fit for the game's themes if you had to confess what you had done to record your progress. And the obvious place to do so would be in a church, a perfect fit for the Western fantasy setting Yuji Horii had chosen for Dragon Quest. And although only one of the game's priests actually saves your game, this practice would eventually become the norm for the series. To help players navigate a much larger world, Dragon Quest II also introduced a network of travel doors, teleportation tiles that zip you from one end of the map to another in an instant, offering a convenient alternative to backtracking. This device allowed for the foreshadowing of distant parts of the world long before you could actually go there, and made the game seem even bigger. But the coolest way Dragon Quest II communicates the increase in size is in how it incorporates the world of the first game into the new map. As you first take to the seas in your sailing ship, you soon come upon some very familiar shores. Dragon Quest's Alefgard is part of the world of Torland. It's a shrunken down version of the original game, but all of the familiar landmarks are still there. And paying a visit to Castle Tentacle and the ruins of the Dragon Lord's castle gives a very nostalgic feeling. Even the shrine south of Remoldar is still around, complete with the pesky old man who tells you to get lost if you don't have Erdrick's token. That Torland is large enough to swallow Alefgard, even if it is just an abbreviated version, really speaks to the scope of the second game. It is a much larger adventure, by my own estimate, more than 7 times as long. And there's a subtle little thing that Yuji Horii did to really drive home this fact. In the Dragon Lord's castle, following a familiar path will lead you to a chest with a familiar reward. The Sword of Erdrick is still there. But even though the legendary blade has the same exact attack power as before, it's no longer the ultimate weapon it was in the first game. It's not the sword that got weaker, it's the world around it that grew bigger. And that's absolutely beautiful. But not everything about Dragon Quest II's exploration gameplay is better than in the first game. Torland is a much larger and more complex world than Alefgard, but it can also feel a lot more linear. Dragon Quest's world design was remarkably open-ended, with its near-perfect freedom and strong emphasis on soft gating mechanics. The game's critical path was very short, and there were only a handful of things you had to do to beat the game. To reach the Dragon Lord's castle, you needed the Rainbow Drop. To make the Rainbow Drop, you had to collect the Stones of Sunlight, the Staff of Rain, and Erdrick's token. Getting the Staff of Rain meant fetching the silver harp from Garin's grave, and both the harp and the Stones of Sunlight were locked behind doors you couldn't open without magic keys from the town of Remoldar. Aside from that, the world was your oyster, and if you already knew what to do, the only real limitation was having to be strong enough to tackle the various monsters of the world's different regions. Dragon Quest II's implementation of soft gating mechanics is much the same as in the first game. The use of bridges to communicate an increase in challenge is still here, though the second game is less strict about its application. Not every bridge means a jump in difficulty, and not every monster rotation is marked by a bridge. With the first game, Yuji Horii set up the guardrail of bridges to help newcomers to the genre understand that venturing far came with its own dangers. With the sequel, Horii felt the training wheels were ready to come off. But on top of this, Dragon Quest II also has a lot of hard gating mechanics. Much of the world is locked away from you until you complete various tasks, and some of them can feel a bit arbitrary. To enter Hargon's Hall and confront the final boss, you must first obtain the Charm of Rubis, which you get by bringing the 5 crests to the Shrine of Rubis. The life crest is hidden in a cave that's sealed until you bring the Eye of Maroth. The eye is kept in the sea cave, which you can only enter once you have the Moon Fragment. The Moon Fragment is in the Tower of the Moon, but you'll need the Watergate key to reach it. The Watergate key and the Water Crest both require the Jailer's key, and the Jailer's key and the Star Crest cannot be found without the Gold key. The Gold key and the two remaining crests, the Sun Crest and the Moon Crest, demand that you also have the ship. The ship is found in Lienport, which you cannot reach unless you've recruited the Princess of Moonbrook and found the Cloak of Wind. To break the princess's curse, you must locate the Mirror of Ra, and both the mirror and the cloak are on the continent of Moonbrook, which you cannot get to without the Prince of Cannock. Finally, to recruit the Prince of Cannock, you have to speak to him in the town of Leftwine, but only after speaking with your father at Maidenhall Castle, and that only after seeking the prince in the Spring of Bravery, assuming you've already talked to his father at Cannock Castle. This explosion in hard gating and the much longer critical path means that even though Dragon Quest II is a much more sophisticated game than the original Dragon Quest, your adventure feels less your own, and as an expression of player-driven exploration, the sequel is a less pure experience. But all of this added complexity also meant the game had more to work with in another area. One of my main criticisms when looking at the original Dragon Quest was that you never received any upgrades that substantially changed how you interacted with the world. Sure, the return spell lets you zip back to the starting castle from anywhere on the map, but you never acquired any items, vehicles, or spells that unlocked shortcuts or new areas of the world. Part of the reason for this was inherent in the way the game was designed. Dragon Quest was essentially a true open-world experience. You could already go everywhere except for Charlock Castle from the very start, so there really wasn't any need to lock areas of the map behind some kind of upgrade. By introducing a lot more hard gating into the game, Dragon Quest II fundamentally changed this formula. Exploring Tourland is a lot more like what you'd expect out of later Japanese RPGs, or an adventure game like Metroid or Zelda. Each major milestone on your quest opens up more of the map for you to explore, including shortcuts that streamline the process of backtracking. The ship especially is a major game changer. It's rare to see an adventure where sailing offers up so much freedom. Unlike a contemporary game like Final Fantasy or a modern RPG like Sea of Stars, Dragon Quest II's ship allows you to make landfall wherever you want, with the only limitation being that you cannot traverse mountains or shallow water. Getting the ship completely changes the way you interact with the world, and while there are still some areas you cannot immediately access, the feeling of freedom you get when you first take to the seas is incredibly cool. Another major improvement from the first game is in how the sequel handles keys. Dragon Quest keys were generic one-use items that opened any locked door, but since they could only be bought at a couple of shops and doors respawned when you reset the game, key management could get more than a little annoying. Dragon Quest II's keys are unique, persistent items that each open a specific type of door. The Silver Key, the Gold Key, the Jailer's Key, and the Watergate Key. And while the final key is only used for a specific purpose, the others each unlock a number of different doors throughout the world. The feeling of getting a new key is immensely satisfying, since by the time you get it, you'll have a laundry list of places to return to try it out. The biggest impact comes from the Gold Key, which opens up an entire network of travel doors that connects the game's shrines, and I had a ton of fun figuring out which one goes where. But even though Dragon Quest II does a much better job with this aspect of the world design, there's still plenty of room for improvement. Travel doors are neat and all, but their placement isn't very well thought out, so they're not all that useful. Unlocking access to new continents behind the recruitment of the 2 additional party members makes sense from a balance perspective, but it feels very artificial. Instead, it would have been a lot cooler if the prince and princess came with special abilities that allowed new modes of traversal. Maybe the prince could have had the ability to unlock certain magical portals, while the princess had a spell that allowed you to float across rivers. Such general capabilities would have broadened your horizons for exploration, instead of locking the path down behind arbitrary plot coupons. I also think it would have been super cool if the moon fragment had seen a wider use. It's used to open the path to the sea cave by sinking the shallows that surround the island. But what if it worked on all shallows, opening up new sea lanes all over the world? And what if the Cloak of Wind could have been used for more than just crossing the Dragon's Horn, like letting you float across narrow pits in dungeons? On that note, the 5 crests should have really pulled some kind of double duty. Collecting MacGuffins that do nothing but open a door somewhere is just kind of boring, and it would have been a lot more interesting if each one also came with a special power. The game's strong emphasis on hard gating allows for a more sophisticated, satisfying sense of progression in the exploration gameplay. But it also means that Dragon Quest II lost some of the charm of the first game. Dragon Quest II was a step away from the near-perfect freedom of Dragon Quest, and I would argue that it pushed Japanese RPGs down the path towards the mostly linear model of world design we've come to associate with the genre since the early 90s. But with that said, Dragon Quest II still gives you a lot of leeway in how to approach your quest. And in the grand scheme of things, it's still a far more open experience than most modern JRPGs. Few games offer the player perfect freedom from the very beginning. Even open world titles like Ghost of Tsushima have parts of the map you cannot explore until you've progressed far enough in the main story. And Dragon Quest II is no exception. But compared to most Japanese RPGs from the 1990s and onward, the amount of freedom this game offers is simply astounding. Roughly a third of the game's total landmass is available for you to explore right from the start. And the feeling I got when I took my first steps outside Maidenhall Castle was seriously intoxicating. There's a lot to see, and chances are that your path through the game is going to be at least a little bit different from another player's. One of the coolest experiences I had was coming back to the starting continent after spending some time around Moonbrook and realizing that there were multiple locations I'd totally missed, including a whole dungeon. Dragon Quest II has plenty of optional content, some of which is pretty cool. The Silver Key allows access to a bunch of useful treasure, but you don't need it to beat the game. The Echoing Flute can be a great help when hunting down the 5 crests, but it's far from mandatory. And a visit to Alefgard yields a lot of good advice, but you can safely skip the whole continent on your second playthrough. While the game's critical path got a lot longer, there's still a great deal of freedom in how you approach it. You could pick up the Cloak of Wind before the Mirror of Ra, though you'd have to challenge yourself to clear the Tower of Wind without the princess. Once you have the ship, you can go after the 5 crests in any order, though for sure some require more work than others. And an early visit to the town of Biran can be a major opportunity to upgrade your equipment, assuming you survive the trip. Some of my best times with the game were those when I had to make a difficult journey to achieve some objective. Stocking up on healing items to clear the Spring of Bravery alone, fighting my way through Gwaelin's Gate to find a new continent on the other side, and making the long twisting trek to the village of Thun were all memorable adventures. But the best of them all was the one where I came the closest to total disaster. My first expedition to the Tower of Wind is the perfect picture of Dragon Quest II at its very best. After a long journey to the remote dungeon, the Prince of Cannock fell in battle while exploring the tower. I now had to make it all the way back to Hamlin alone, without magic and low on hit points. Every random encounter put a knot in the pit of my stomach. Every battle had me on the edge of my seat, picking off monsters where I could and running when I couldn't, emptying my inventory to somehow just barely stay alive. It all came down to the wire, and the feeling when I limped into Hamlin, a single hit away from kicking the bucket, felt like the climactic end to some great adventure. This is what old school RPGs are all about. And the best part is, I hadn't even meant to go to the Tower of Wind. I found the dungeon by mistake. because Dragon Quest II has a great sense of discovery. Despite frequent frustrations, exploring the world is fun and exciting. There's a lot more to find compared to the first game, and even if you do go the wrong way, there's a good chance you'll stumble over something cool. There are parts of the world that can feel a bit empty, but this is likely the result of content that had to be cut. The facts are a little hard to pin down, but Yuji Horii has allegedly said that the promontory of Olivia from Dragon Quest III was originally meant for the second game, though it was supposed to be called Lorelei's Cape. And it's been suggested that there might have been an oasis town planned for the large desert south of the Dragon's Horn, which seems to track given the large distance to cover between Hamlin and Lienport. A town here would have made a great way station on your journey, and I can't help but feel that the castle town of Isis in Dragon Quest III is a direct callback to what could have been in the second game. Just like the first game, Dragon Quest II works best when you dive into it blind. Since I didn't use a guide, I never knew where I was supposed to go next or how to play, and just as I did with Dragon Quest, I drew my own map while playing this game. Tile by tile, I patched together my knowledge of the land in Google Sheets until the world of Dragon Quest II started to come together both on the screen and in my head. Filling in 65,000 tiles on a spreadsheet is a huge waste of time, but I found the process immensely satisfying. No quest log or journal to track important information, no markers or waypoints telling me where to go. Just a vast, unconquered wilderness to explore, one tile at a time. In its best moments, Dragon Quest II is a game of pure exploration. Travel the world, talk to NPCs, and try everything you can think of, and you'll surely find a way forward. Except when you don't, because Dragon Quest II fails at something the first game did exceptionally well. One of the greatest strengths of Dragon Quest was in how it used its NPCs to guide the player within the context of the world. Every single secret the game hid could be revealed simply by talking to the people you ran across, even if some of the clues were a little harder to grasp. Given that Dragon Quest II has a much larger scope, this aspect of player guidance becomes even more important in the sequel. For the most part, the game does a pretty good job of pulling it off. Even though this was the first time I've played any version of this game, I was able to find my way through most of the adventure without any trouble. The sense of freedom you get from sailing around this vast world looking for clues on how to collect the 5 crests can be absolutely incredible, even by modern standards. And despite some pretty awkward NPC dialogue, the game still does a great job of letting you figure things out on your own. The perfect example comes from how the game handles the Princess of Moonbrook. The fate of the princess, the powers of the Mirror of Ra, and the location of the missing artifact are all given by separate NPCs, but no one outright tells you what to do, and putting it all together on your own is so much more satisfying. Given how heavy-handed modern games can be about player instructions, having to think for yourself for once is pretty refreshing, and the fact that you're not constantly handheld throughout the experience makes it feel so much more like your own adventure. But then there are those moments in the game where I was beating my head against a wall trying to find the path forward. Because as good as the game generally is at giving you the information you need, it doesn't always hit right. Once you reach Lienport and get the ship, a whole new world opens up, and it's honestly hard to know where to go next. While I appreciate the level of freedom gained at this stage, and make no mistake, it's a huge deal, the game could have done more to keep you on track. Some of the steps you have to take to beat the game can be incredibly obscure. The water crest is in an underground passage beneath the village of Hamlin, but I never got any indication that this was the case. So unless you're obsessively searching every tile, you'll have no idea it's even there. The location of the Sun Crest is hinted at, but only if you connect that this particular area is the so-called Fire Monolith, and you still have to grasp that you can walk through this tile to go outside the walls then search every patch of grass around the shrine to find the crest. And then there's the final dungeon. To get inside Hargon's Hall, you need to use the Eye of Malroth while standing on a particular tile near the back of the first floor. But no one in the game ever suggests this. Not to mention that you already used the eye to enter the cave to Roan, which was supposed to be its intended use. So the only way to figure this out without a guide is to try every item in your inventory while standing on a somewhat suspicious looking tile. But the most frustrating roadblock I hit on my playthrough was trying to find the Watergate key. You hear a lot of talk about the legendary thief Rogue Fastfingers and his stolen key, but I had to scour the world 2 or 3 times over before I finally found him. You're meant to carefully search the cell he supposedly escaped from in order to find a secret passage. It's essentially a locked room mystery where the clever twist is that the prisoner never actually left. And it could have been a really cool puzzle. But the way the information is presented strongly suggests that Rogue Fastfingers is anywhere but the town of Welgard, so the average player is unlikely to look for him there. And sure, if you're looking for crests, you could go around spamming the echoing flute and listen for a response, since the flute makes a sound if you use it on a screen that has a crest. But that's if you get how it's meant to be used. The way its function was hinted at in the game was so confusing, it ended up sending me on a wild goose chase, thinking I was supposed to play the flute in the chamber at the top of the lighthouse. It's little mistakes like these that sour the mood when exploring Dragon Quest II's world and drive players to pick up a walkthrough. With just a little better guidance, this could have been an incredibly well-crafted adventure, but as frustrating as exploring the overworld can be at times, it's nothing compared to how tedious the game's more hostile environments can be. Like every other aspect of Dragon Quest II, the dungeon crawling experience is greatly expanded from the first game. Not only are there twice as many dungeons to explore, but the ones you get are also a lot more interesting. And part of the reason for that is a pretty fundamental change to how you go about exploring them. In Dragon Quest, dungeons were pitch black without the aid of a torch, and even when you had a source of light, you could only spy a couple of steps in every direction, which made exploration a slow and deliberate process, and meticulous mapping a near necessity. Dragon Quest II did away with this mechanic, which allowed for these featureless mazes to transform into more detailed environments. Walls and corridors are now generally double wide, and different sections of a dungeon are often divided into separate rooms that you cannot see between, adding a sense of mystery to the experience. In return, the dungeon layouts are less labyrinthine, making pathfinding more about reading your environment than mapping a maze. The strictly underground environments of Dragon Quest were also complemented by a new category of dungeons. Towers add an element of verticality to exploration, presenting new obstacles as well as new opportunities. You now have to worry about falling off a ledge and having to start a dungeon over, but you also have a quick shortcut out of the tower when you need to escape. The implementation is far from perfect, since the game's controls have a sticky quality that makes precision navigation kind of hard, but is used to good effect in several dungeons. You'll occasionally run into NPCs while exploring the game's dungeons, and there's even a couple of simple scenarios that play out inside these environments, such as following a demon in disguise to a trap in the lighthouse. But the coolest example is Moonbrook Castle, an optional dungeon with no treasure, where you explore the blighted ruins of the fallen castle and gather information by talking to the ghosts that haunt it, including that of the slain king. The increase in complexity and variation makes Dragon Quest II's dungeons a lot less predictable, and the dungeon crawling experience more rewarding, at least in the spiritual sense, because when it comes to material rewards, Dragon Quest II's dungeons are much less generous. Treasure chests generally provide you with token amounts of gold, medicinal herbs, or low-level gear you already have, and some chests are even trapped, further skewing the risk-reward ratio in the direction of don't bother. The number of truly worthwhile pickups found in the game's dungeons can be counted on the fingers of one hand. So even when you work hard to retrieve some remote chest, you usually end up feeling cheated. There's a long lava-filled passage in the sea cave that leads to a chest, but it only holds about 100 gold. And a twisting branch of the lighthouse tower rewards you with a chain sickle, a weapon that's been obsolete for several hours. But the most blatant example of this design comes in the Tower of Wind, where after a long and arduous climb, the treasure chest at the very top is completely empty. You came all this way just to get trolled. To be fair, the game has good reason to be stingy with treasure. Just like in Dragon Quest, treasure chests respawn when you reset the game, which means that you can return to loot the same chest over and over. As I mentioned before, the Japanese version of Dragon Quest II still used a password system to store progress, and tracking the state of 100 or more chests would have made an already long password completely unmanageable. So they settled on the compromise of giving mostly garbage rewards, and the one time they didn't, it led to a major exploit. In the dungeons beneath Castle Maidenhall, one of the prisoners turns into a monster and attacks you when you talk to him. Defeat him and you get a guaranteed drop of a Staff of Thunder, a powerful magical weapon that also happens to sell for 19,500 gold, instantly breaking the game's economy the moment you realize that you can reset the game every time you want to get another one. But not all of the game's empty chests can be explained by password limitations. Some were meant to hold items that were cut during development, either for lack of memory or because they ran out of time. One idea that didn't make it was an item called the Abunai Mizugi, literally dangerous swimsuit. This was supposed to be a really strong armor exclusive to the Princess of Moonbrook, and if she wore it, her sprite would change to show her wearing a sexy bikini. The item did eventually make it into the MSX port of the game, and later showed up in Dragon Quest III as the revealing swimsuit. Starting from the golden age in the early 90s, JRPG dungeons often featured interesting puzzles, engaging scenarios, and a great variety of environments and experiences. Dragon Quest II's dungeons are only the prototypical version of that. They're a step up in terms of complexity, but they're still not particularly fun to explore. And with few rewards to speak of, dungeon crawling in Dragon Quest II is a very old school experience, by which I mean that it's really all about survival. Surviving a trip through one of Dragon Quest II's labyrinthine dungeons is as much a matter of resource management as it is navigation. Pathfinding is incredibly important, but unless you're using a guide, you are going to get lost a lot before you find your way, which means you'll have to fight numerous random encounters. And unlike a game like, say, Final Fantasy VI, where the odds are stacked in your favor and the math is tuned to ensure that even a player who beelines the main story can scrape their way through without having to grind, you're going to have to work a lot harder to survive in Dragon Quest II. The sheer number of random encounters can be absolutely exhausting, especially since their distribution is so random. You're just as likely to walk for long stretches of time without fighting anything as you are to get hit with multiple battles in consecutive steps. My personal record was 4 random encounters in 4 steps, and that's just not a fun way to live your life. Surviving these journeys is all about using your limited resources in the smartest way possible. It's about deciding when and where to fight, how to best deal with different monsters, and how to use your magic. You might be tempted to stock up on a lot of healing items, but there's no shared party inventory, and each character can only carry up to 8 items at a time, including all of their equipment and key items. There's no vault in which to store unwanted items in the original version, and consumable items don't stack, so the closer you get to the end of the game, the less space you have to spare for anything but the essentials. While the early dungeons are fairly lenient, the later ones get successively harder, and if you're not using a guide, you'll usually have to make multiple trips to finish one off. There are no save points or places to rest in the middle of dungeons, The only way to restore MP outside of towns is a rare item most players won't even see in the average playthrough, and some monsters even drain your magic points through special moves. Some dungeons are worse than others. The lighthouse is full of branching paths with dead ends or locked doors. The sea cave's confusing architecture is designed to throw you for a loop. And the cave to Rhone is 100% an experiment in psychological warfare. Invisible pitfalls, pointless stairs and long side passages, trapped and empty chests, and a true maze with infinite loops to drive you insane. It all feels more like a punishment than something you do for fun. All of these factors combine to make Dragon Quest II's dungeons extremely unforgiving. The encounter design means a single stroke of bad luck can wipe you out. Only the prince can revive fallen allies, and then only at higher levels. There is an item that can bring an ally back, but you can only carry one at a time, and you have to sail to a remote island to fetch it. None of this would have been a problem if the game had just delivered on the fundamental promise of the RPG. Making multiple trips to the same dungeon, mapping out the different paths, chasing down dead ends, finding treasure and defeating monsters could have been a stellar experience, as long as you actually got stronger while doing so. But since the character progression is so busted, the dungeons never really get much easier. I made 6 separate trips to the lighthouse before I'd fully mapped it, but in spite of gaining multiple levels along the way, the last trip was just as hard as the first. So on top of improving your odds by grinding levels, getting the best possible gear, perfecting your routing, and making the right choices in battle, to beat the dungeon, you're also going to need a little luck. And nowhere in the game is this more evident than in the final dungeon. Before you can take on the evil Hargon, you first need to defeat his 3 lieutenants, Atlas, Pazuzu, and Zarlox. And even when you think you've won, the game pits you against the true evil, the Master of Destruction, Malroth. All of these bosses hit super hard, are immune to most magic, and have high enough defenses that only the hero can really hurt them. And this is after you've already made it through the brutal gauntlet of Hargon's Hall. To make matters worse, Hargon and Malroth both have the Heal All spell, so there's a decent chance each round that they'll restore themselves to full HP, undoing all of your hard work. Which means that whether or not you can actually win is entirely up to luck. Grinding to max level helps, but the outcome of these battles is still in the hands of fate. Botched character progression, poor monster balance, and horrible difficulty spikes make for a pretty miserable experience. Dragon Quest was such a finely tuned adventure, so how could a sequel turn out like this? To answer this question, we have to revisit the process of how the game was made, and explore a little concept we'd like to call development hell. Some of Dragon Quest II's issues can be traced back to technical limitations, but most of the problems arose from the game's increased complexity. For Dragon Quest, Koichi Nakamura had done all of the coding himself, but this was no longer possible with the sequel. For Dragon Quest II, Nakamura's Chunsoft began to scale up to a major operation, bringing in additional personnel to help share the workload of a much more ambitious project. And this process was not without its issues. To find help, Chunsoft hired out of university, and by Nakamura's own admission, none of the people involved, himself included, were truly professional software developers. The task of programming the game was split between 4 people, all working on the same codebase but without any real experience in developing software as a team, tracking code commits, or how to debug the software. The further they got into the project, the more bugs started to crop up, and the lack of structure and professionalism meant that when people got stressed, everyone started to blame each other, creating a hostile work environment. Nakamura ended up spending more time mediating conflicts than debugging the code, and without a clear plan for how to get it all done, the project got more and more delayed. Despite what we would see as a short development cycle by today's standards, Nakamura recalls that they were constantly told they were late. The team eventually did pull it together, but by then it was already November, and the game was meant to be released in late December. This might have been possible to achieve, except for one big problem. Dragon Quest's smooth difficulty curve and crisp game balance had been largely due to two reasons. First, the limited scope of one hero fighting a single monster at a time was easy to tune. Second, both Horii and Nakamura had time to spare after development wrapped up to actually test the game, playing it through over and over and tweaking the balance to get it just right. But the sequel was a much longer, much more complex game, and because development was so tight, neither Horii nor Nakamura were able to actually sit down and try it out until it was almost too late. When they finally did, they realized it was far too difficult. So difficult that you couldn't even make it to the Prince of Cannock without dying. Unwilling to ship a broken game, Nakamura asked for another month to get the balance right, and the team got to work on fixing the issues. Horii first limited the number of monsters that could appear in a single encounter on the starting continent to no more than 3. This helped a lot, but it still wasn't enough. During development, Castle Cannock had been located further west, but getting there and back again with just the hero proved a bit too hard. So the castle was moved to the foothills north of Leftwine, and the lake cave took its place on the empty island. The empty chest at the top of the Tower of Wind can also be explained by this process. The Mirror of Ra had originally been meant for this chest, but after realizing that clearing the tower would be difficult without the full party, Horii ended up moving it out to the swamp. These changes were fairly straightforward and had a good effect on the early game, but solving the deeper issues would take a lot more effort. The introduction of groups of monsters meant that there were now thousands of possible combinations of enemies to consider. Testing them all would be an impossible task. What the team could do was carefully playtest the game, gather feedback, make small adjustments, and start all over. Again and again. This process took so many iterations and got so bad that at one point they were producing and distributing new prototypes on a daily basis, and Horii vividly recalls labeling one such copy as the December 8th 4 AM version. Despite their best efforts, they were really only able to fix the balance up until the point where you get the ship, after which the carefully tuned experience starts to break down. And the team were well aware of this fact even then. Nakamura has said that at the time the game was finally delivered to the factory for production, not a single member of the development team had played the game through from start to finish. Nakamura and Horii have both described the making of Dragon Quest II as one of, if not the most challenging time in their careers. By mid-December of 1986, when the work was finally done, Horii collapsed from a stomach ulcer brought on by the stress. And in an interview with Nintendo Power in 2007, he says he was inches away from having a permanent hole in his stomach. Nakamura was so disillusioned with the quality of the game that he thought about closing down Chunsoft and calling it quits. Even decades later, he mentioned having nightmares about Dragon Quest II's development and getting shivers down his spine when he hears the game's soundtrack. But even though the team wasn't able to ship exactly the product they wanted the first time around, they would have several more chances to get it right. And the first of these came 3 years later, when Enix of America brought Dragon Quest II to North America as Dragon Warrior 2. Dragon Warrior 2 was released in North America on October 30th, 1990. A little over a year after the first game finally made it out of Japan. As I explained in my Dragon Quest retrospective, a trademark conflict with the publishers of a tabletop role-playing game bearing the same title forced Nintendo of America to make a name change, releasing the game as Dragon Warrior. When Enix of America took over publishing duties for their series in North America, they held on to this naming standard, which meant that Dragon Quest II became Dragon Warrior 2. Enix of America also stuck with many of the stylistic choices made when translating the first game. the whimsical Japanese text was replaced with lofty Elizabethan English with highlights such as "Of experience points thou hast gained 40" and "Who comes hither to disturb the great Hargon?" But the game is not without its tongue-in-cheek references to North American pop culture, such as the old man at the Houses of Healing that uses a catchphrase from Hill Street Blues, an influential American TV show from the 1980s. Naming conventions were also kept consistent with the previous Dragon Warrior, such as Erdrick and Gwaelin instead of Loto and Laura. This also meant that locations named after them, such as Laura's Cave and the hero's home kingdom of Laurasia, had to follow suit, becoming Gwaelin's Gate and Maidenhall. Just like with Dragon Warrior, many new locations had their names tweaked to sound better in English. Lirisa, Rupugana, and Moon Pitta were exchanged for Leftwine, Lianport, and Hamlin, and the Master of Destruction, Shido, became Malroth instead, which I honestly think is a great name for an evil god. Most of the spells retain the utilitarian descriptors from the first game, with names like Heal More, Stop Spell, and Return, a far cry from the quirky, impossible to translate Japanese spell names like Hoimi and Gira. But the game's expanded repertoire of attack magic got an overhaul, fixing them with monikers that better evoke the fantasy setting, such as Fireball, Infernos, and Exploded. To appease Nintendo of America's famously strict content guidelines from the 80s and 90s, the translators also had to engage in a bit of censorship. A conversation where a girl behind a church in Lianport offers the sexually suggestive service of Puff Puff if and only if the princess is dead was scrubbed. And anything that smacked of religion had to go. Churches became houses of healing, shrines turned into monoliths, the villain Hargon went from being a high priest to a wizard, and crosses were replaced with stars, which also meant that your defeated allies followed you around as ghosts instead of being dragged behind you in coffins bearing the sign of the cross. The game also got a really cool new intro sequence. While the Japanese version starts from the point where the Moonbrook soldier arrives in Maidenhall Castle, Dragon Warrior 2 features a fully realized cutscene showing Hargon's attack on Moonbrook Castle and the death of the king. And I also have to call out the added end screen for when you beat the game, that shows an absolutely gorgeous animated illustration of Erdrick's sword, shield, and helm. Some of the best pixel art I've ever seen on an 8-bit console. But the release of Dragon Warrior 2 wasn't just a way to expand the market to a Western audience. It was also a chance to fix some of the most glaring issues with the original version. Just like with Dragon Warrior, the sequel got a proper battery-powered save function, so North American players could store their progress without relying on long written passwords. In an effort to salvage the game's broken balance, some monsters had their stats altered, with most of the tweaks being done to experience values. Around half of the game's monsters got a boost to the amount of XP they awarded, some of them by quite a lot. Most significantly, several of the enemies encountered in the Rhone Plateau and Hargon's Hall saw huge increases. Japanese players would have had to fight almost twice as many battles to max out their level, which just blows my mind. But perhaps the single most impactful change is actually a merciful little tweak that makes the Rhone Plateau a lot more forgiving. In the Japanese version, the old man at the monolith in Rhone restores your HP and MP when you talk to him. In the North American version, he also revives your dead party members. This slightly eases the brutality of life in the Rhone, since you'd otherwise have to leave the plateau to resurrect the Prince of Cannock if he falls in battle, which he does a lot. While there were quite a lot of minor changes made between the Japanese and North American versions, Dragon Quest II and Dragon Warrior 2 are still fundamentally the same game, with mostly the same gameplay experience. But Enix would eventually get a chance to make things right in their home market. In December of 1993, Enix released Dragon Quest I and II, a Super Famicom game pack containing a bundle of the first two games in the Dragon Quest series, the first of several remakes of the classic games. Translating the Famicom originals onto Nintendo's 16-bit console, meant the games got significant upgrades to sound and graphics. They still look and feel pretty basic next to other Japanese RPGs of the same era, but the update gave the games more detailed and colorful environments, battle screen backgrounds, spell animations, and access to a sound chip that could do much better justice to Koichi Sugiyama's excellent compositions. The Super Famicom version of Dragon Quest II also incorporated several welcome improvements to the game's interface, such as streamlined menu navigation, the option to press the X button to interact contextually with NPCs, doors, and chests instead of having to open the menu, and the opportunity to see which of your party members will benefit from a piece of equipment before handing over your money at a shop. Extra NPCs were added to towns and shrines to give a bit of better guidance about where to go to progress your quest, like this imp outside the shrine on the path to the cave to Rhone who tells you about the water crest in the town of Hamlin. And roguey Fastfinger's obscure hiding spot in Welgarth is now hinted at by the presence of debris on the floor of his cell. The remake also incorporates a bunch of features that got their start in Dragon Quest III, such as seeds and acorns that permanently increase a character's attributes, a bank where you can store unneeded equipment and safeguard your gold, and the agility attribute, which influences the order in which characters act in each round of combat. A pretty huge deal in a game where heroes and monsters can both fall to a couple of hits. Dungeon crawling is a lot more fun now. Since the remake tracks the contents of chests on your save file, they could be stocked with much better rewards. And although you're still constrained by the limits of the hero's inventory, the number of items each character can carry was increased from 8 to 10, which helps mitigate the abundance of key items you pick up on your quest. Attacks that target defeated monster groups are now automatically redirected to the remaining enemies, making combat easier, if a bit mindless. Some weapons and armor received massive buffs, especially the ones intended for the prince and princess. Better yet, a few weapons that were limited to the hero can now be equipped by the prince, including the Sword of Erdrick and the Sword of Light, which ends up being a huge gain. Magic also got a bit of a boost. The prince and princess's best offensive spells deal a lot more damage now. Buffs and debuffs have a stronger effect, and the princess now eventually learns the revive spell, making you less vulnerable to bad luck. Experience values for monsters were once again readjusted across the board, though not always upwards. On the whole, it's a net positive, especially in the back half of the game. Metal slimes and metal babbles now give almost 10 times as much XP as in the Famicom version, making it well worth it to chase them down. Finally, while I don't have the proof to back this up, some enemies seem to have been toned down, and I swear they must have made some changes under the hood to fix the math, because leveling up seems to make a much bigger difference than in the original game. None of the changes are monumental on their own, but together they add up. The end result is a game that's still challenging but feels a lot more fair. You still have to do a lot of grinding, and a single bad encounter can still wipe the party, but the overall experience is a lot more enjoyable. The cave to Rhone remains very tough, and the Rhone plateau is still a brutal difficulty spike, but things actually get easier now as you level up, and the final battle felt just right. Dragon Quest I and II for the Super Famicom was the first of several remakes of the game, and each successive version made more and more tweaks to the gameplay experience. Basically, the newer the version of the game you play, the smoother and easier the ride is. But while it might be tempting to say that these newer versions are objectively better, I would say that depends. Because in spite of its perceived flaws, the original version of Dragon Quest II was exactly the game it needed to be. The right game at the right time. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. I read every comment I get, no matter how old the video is, and if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel so I know people want to see more videos like this. Whatever dim view we in the West may have of the game today, Dragon Quest II's initial reception was extremely positive. The game earned a near-perfect 38 out of 40 combined score from Famitsu, sold an astounding 2.4 million copies by the end of the first year, and even as late as 2006, by which time Japanese RPG fans had plenty of time to digest the game's flaws, readers of Famitsu voted Dragon Quest II the 17th best game of all time, ahead of titles like Final Fantasy IX, Chrono Trigger, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Metal Gear Solid. In short, Dragon Quest II was a huge success, and a lot of it came down to timing. Koichi Nakamura has said multiple times over the years that Dragon Quest was a bit of a disappointment to the team in terms of initial success. With a little help from Yuji Horii singing the game's praises in the pages of Shonen Jump, sales eventually picked up, and by the time it had been out for 6 months, it had sold 1 million copies, and showed no signs of slowing down. In spite of delays, Dragon Quest II was released 2 months later, right in the middle of this frenzy. And even though the game's development had been so troubled, and the team were so disillusioned with the quality of the final product, when Dragon Quest II finally hit the shelves of stores across Japan, it was an entirely different story. In an interview with Famitsu from 2014, translated by Shmuplations, Nakamura said, "When I was asked what the best experience I've had in my 30 years at Chunsoft was, I can also point to the release day of Dragon Quest II, when we saw people standing in those amazingly long lines to purchase the game." Dragon Quest II was a huge hit, and the game's unintentionally brutal difficulty may have actually worked in its favor. Unlike the first game, beating Dragon Quest II wasn't as simple as plugging away until you were powerful enough to steamroll the final dungeon. No matter how much grinding you did, the game never actually got easy, and some of the steps along the quest could be incredibly hard to grasp. It might not have been the guiding principle of accessibility that the original Dragon Quest championed, but it worked out pretty well for its time. A game that frustrated you, that felt a little bit unfair at times, but kept you coming back for more. A game that felt like a true achievement once you actually beat it. To play this game the way it was intended is a test of patience, but in the late 80s, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. This was a time of less distractions, when kids weren't spoiled for choice for what to do. No YouTube, no Netflix, no library of free-to-play games or access to thousands of scanned manga just a Google search away. So we found ways not to be bored. A long game, even a needlessly frustrating one, could fill your days with something to do for hours on end, even to the point of obsession. We didn't question the difficulty, the unfair design, the way a single stroke of bad luck could erase an hour's worth of progress. We just gritted our teeth and tried again. We filled reams of graph paper with detailed maps, copied the words of NPCs into notebooks and analyzed each one for hidden meanings, and pushed against every wall and searched every tile for secrets. And because patience eventually runs out, we'd ask for help, which in the dark ages of the 1980s, before you could look up a guide online, meant relying on other people. And in the case of a particularly brutal game like Dragon Quest II, the result was that word of mouth spread like crazy. Because of the game's difficulty, everyone was talking about it. People became obsessed with beating the game, and most of them couldn't do it alone. And it wasn't just kids either. The game's secrets and strategies were discussed at workplaces as well as schools. Though I never got a chance to play Dragon Quest II back in the day, it makes me think of another game from my own childhood. Castlevania II: Simon's Quest is often portrayed as a terrible sequel, but this was one of my favorite games for the NES back when it was new. The sprawling world with its hidden pitfalls and ridiculously arcane secrets gave the feeling of infinite discovery, the impression that anything was possible, in a time before the internet pulled back the veil and dispelled all rumors and hearsay. And while I wouldn't sit down to play it for fun today, a game like this had its time and place. And I'll bet the same was true of the original version of Dragon Quest II. For all its flaws, Dragon Quest II is still a grand adventure. and in its best moments, I could feel a spark of the magic this game must have had back in 1987. But ultimately, it is a bit of a heartbreaker. It starts out with tremendous potential, but the experience is bogged down by countless flaws. Insane difficulty spikes bring the forward momentum to an absolute halt. The world is massive, but most of my time was spent grinding for levels or checking the same places over and over for missing key items. But what I cannot get over is how unsatisfying the game ultimately feels. Dragon Quest II botches the key promise of the console RPG, that the more effort you put in, the easier things will get. What's the point of gaining a level if you don't even notice the difference? And the frustrating thing is that it wouldn't have taken a lot for me to truly enjoy this game. A wider assortment of weapons and armor, so you have something to look forward to when you're grinding battles. Better stocked treasure chests to make dungeon crawling a bit more exciting. A couple of extra NPCs to help you find the 5 crests, maybe tweak the final bosses so they don't resist magic so often, nerf a couple of enemies, and give the princess the revive spell. And most importantly by far, some clever tweaks to the game's math, to ensure that every level you gain makes a real difference in taking on the game's monsters, allowing you to actually level into comfort. With these relatively simple tweaks, Dragon Quest II would have been a great old-school RPG even today. That said, when you make a retrospective of a video game, you have to put the game in its proper context. Dragon Quest II might be the black sheep of the series today, but back then, it was a massively ambitious project that laid the foundation for future triumphs. It's the game that turned Dragon Quest from a one-hit wonder into a bona fide franchise. This is where the series started to take on more of its own identity, a unique blend of the standard tropes of Western fantasy, Akira Toriyama's wild imagination, and Yuji Horii's bizarre and wonderful mind. I also want to take this opportunity to give credit where credit is due. Within the gaming community, we tend to focus on a few key figures, the shining stars of game development who get all the attention and admiration. But making a game is a mostly collaborative effort, and this industry has a lot of unsung heroes. Yuji Horii is remembered today as the creator of Dragon Quest, and while his contributions to the series cannot be overstated, I think it's more fair to say that he is the co-creator of Dragon Quest, because the series wouldn't exist without the equally important contributions of his partner in crime, Koichi Nakamura. Nakamura ended up leaving the series behind after finishing work on Dragon Quest V and moving on to other projects, but his contributions to Dragon Quest should not be ignored. Nakamura and Horii were equal collaborators on the first game, working together to brainstorm ideas, figure out game systems, and make the product shine. And it was Nakamura's wizardry with the code that allowed for many of the most ambitious features of the early games to see the light of day. I never see anyone talk about Nakamura these days, and I didn't even know his name until I started researching the origins of Dragon Quest. And I think that's a real shame. And what blows my mind when I look at the facts is how young he was when these games were made. Nakamura was born on August 15, 1964, meaning that he would have been only 22 years old when Dragon Quest II came out. Nakamura may not have had the experience required to run a software company at the time, but he did the best he could. And consider what would have happened if he and his team gave up. What if Dragon Quest II never saw the light of day? Would the original game be just a footnote in the history of console RPGs? That's a crazy thought. That someone that young had both the know-how to get this project done and the mental fortitude to endure development hell speaks very highly of this man's character. So, Nakamura-sensei, otsukarasama desu. Dragon Quest taught a generation of Japanese gamers how to play an RPG. Dragon Quest II offered them a challenge, a richer, deeper experience. And even though the game had a lot of flaws, the basic formula was strong enough that the audience didn't seem to care. Dragon Quest was here to stay, and the best was yet to come. Anyway, I'm just some guy on YouTube and these are just my personal opinions. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Dragon Quest II in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.